Well, first of all, I will give you the oral transmission of 50 verses on following your teacher. Later on, if you were to study it, I think it's really important for you to receive the oral transmission, especially some Kimples and Kimmels do not have the oral transmission yet. Therefore, I'm giving you the oral transmission first.
Bishaka urkut of Lamar Napche Babchum than the Dorji. Senhua la Shamsrlo, Hardon Dorji, Senhui on Neto Vikira, Lami Javki, Pamochevjan. Tudshiti, Tifton Banner, Trimiter, Gidam, Le Somba, Dordi Shafan, then keep him Yambreki, Wonkerum Shoto, Dorji, Logon Lana, Tivjan, Chobjinjit, Kamji, Tirzum, Moon Chamsar. Chogda tape tirsumda kirkurmeto je tarme tombavlama nimkara jang javlavshevo shapshevo kimba gamna sarva la jiktin mo parpang vishra tambi chula tamchula somdandarte terjing zambi vlo sha dantpa tang dangwa tang tonji shawa sokhnim kar terjik chanji kunsharte shiksha tamba manler pang Lama tang no loma tang somber tamtsig nyamgir ve hwawo tang bu lokhon tang lob mimjer aftagbra sha lordun lob me lamar no nyerje me chang chola de khang shang chigla ma dam tang dom dam chebr mafsha wo tan jang tarla lo chur dam zordan chang la yorje med shingag dang gitki jongwa shi nyang tser dan jang tan chum ke Deni de chena yongsa shi kirnkurun ripi lelam ke ngarshat bai vjora shi rapta jejang wang bo tar tenjim gombo samshi ne lobmar kerne te nina na sangje tamchi nibe na dinar tagdar dingmar top slogon lanar mopati yamdang sevi narnamdang dondang ramdang tignam ki rmongchin tenan chivaran gir Jarbo me dang zhirdig dang, che dang kanzhor kunbo dang, don dang longzhen namki kyang, sadna semchang nyarwan zho. Namiyang logon takki na kunda sem chig mafsharte, karter mongbar shijir na nyarwa ngibaran separan gir. Narmin lasogon jigrung nyarwa tamba kanyang ba, logon lanar mopar nam ter nang nibar yang tak shat tevin bapa tamche chig durjir logon lochu chig gewa rabta mavzhong namyar mapar mavshiyo lama kipchi lama lana kipchi yon jisam tambar vjimbar vsha dina rimso nopar nam shirjam jongor mangyaro ranga tamchig logon vjinman vadang chongma dang rang shchok ki kyang temshi na longshud goyowa chmuchi go Kamshir karwa shiwa na changme pariyar nyekawe sangye nyekyang tsond tsenda nyela terwar shida shtagda ranga tamchi uchong shtagda tevzhang shigbamchir shtagda lama yang layang baran dana sangye kandang dra mazit tenan dopa yi chongzid yegong kandang kang shinda kyabaran gyarwa na tedang tena lamar vzhin tevzhin sangye tamchi lashtagda vshinba nyetta nyir Devshin sonum tsogyin te, tsogle nguchum chogdan gir. Devish lubma nyarjiyaktung tsuchum zope yondarandan slogon dana dorjin zan tatat parna maftakko. Churtin shiginji diginjig pe, chibma gombar mafsha na, lamdang standang zhomba so gom mafsha war muchokko. Loju jimbo tag gasim gi vlamib gana batim nyan. Rigba yina mani ba, mani te la tsiki vjang. Rigbayi na mani ba mani dana zik Vlama le na nguchab tam thori tang na dewa tob Devin bapa tamchi ki Vlamib ka le ndamab sha Vlamir ze na chuk chiv zhin na Vlamir digba gang Vlama zhin Deyin khor na nyen zhin de nyambar vizhig per tagdab sam Martan digdang ngunro dang Tsigdur tagdang shiangba dang Stan la shkang juk tagba na Tagbar na, skipper na, lagzhaw niwar mafsha go. tagna lamba na nyardang dikbar mafsha war tagda te ifshaga la dang ke phusum sokbar ji chirma la sok ndorwa dang tan la kang jog kyongwa dang chagdang sobar mawa tag lamim danda mafsha wo.
Okay, so that's the first part of the oral transmission, and I'll give you the rest of the oral transmission tomorrow. So now I'm going to give you the oral transmission of transforming suffering and happiness into enlightenment.
Tertir blov jangvi jidn jamba kog yangwa zhognab dewa kong hwawa chula varchid me par jengen tamchi hwadang trashi ji chukzang charwar tagdib dewi rjin tsambaram jongte nigmi tisi lamjabna kochan dartawa metam marung. Di tse zeri dungar me pi wangar dungar gjan namjang ghamagma lak cha longwar tawaran zhor mazid nat sokjang parchir rangloksan zhorter ngunji tambe kanglagang magawa tang yidmu dewa mafshibi sim manchigba de manchigbe rlong manchig de wanga lijim jongwa zhanyang manchig di jang sim manchigba la sokba devin korlo korbar songba tang rtawong garma chanla shar nam alag ni partarda jigbi ramjin chanla njer namji alag zar lajang ngang tambar nam tabrak kawrak songba la sokbe shibir shawo. Tertirim kebanar kirdik tamchid semla ragli birim tongni derkit semgi stanen sorte shkiki gyosok rangla tsangwe shirurla rag mali shang semchin mayin beg nopa kanki kyam zawar mebadang chiva tsayang jisi mjangwa la sokba yende ti shtagda chivi tsayang jisi mjangwa yende ti shtagda rangwang toba yino shangchib senhwa chu tamchib dewe nombi tangin zan yang dartaw rjaba yino. Lunbonu derkit shirur ki yerle sorda rene jikte tenar kit chechong gang jabkyang tenar kit telar kit chechong gang jabkyang mo wang malak joto shanglak zerwa tarda songne marle badang manzon badang tsut matigba lasokba togda mankyur ba kona mangjang jarkin lasok gi no pi glagdang jedi snyandok jongzat rekyang pjarni rowe sharuk kushik wo chitsong sujang rangavar mugung gongmokcha bartarda yitwanda marungwa shartak zape la wubgeran je nyomo rangdig rang dingarwa jigle mette nabgyak chig la chirwa nyangtam yino lamjabak kafshikir dingar tangda lenligdang jibshid sogle shapa nad gdun lamkirki manga janyang mangda yodn mun ndarir dingar tanglen shikib zan pagba jiwala dang di jimjam kebi yagzhongla tenne kubdewar shado nibam tabji kengog sogji rigbim chirgi kengan dingar staja dedaka mangzang ya marni pegnelik tongwan lam chogda jiwar yitchangde vjagjang tele langwa naya ngar jikchag dang jimba la sogba kiti ki vlongur dingar charlik tar mayimbar mangzamgi kusugda tawe zirgi number shate gebir mavjoto.
I should have generated bodhicitta at the beginning, but let's generate the supreme bodhicitta in order to liberate all sentient beings. So let's continue today on the teaching of transforming suffering and happiness into enlightenment. As we've studied yesterday, in our daily life, in fact, there are circumstances that is unwanted and unfavorable, and to such situations we usually generate suffering, or we have suffering during such circumstances, and vice versa. I think by now you would probably know that whatever things that we're facing, whatever circumstances we're facing, let it be harmful or unbeneficial if you continuously to perceive circumstances in such a way, then it will become the cause of suffering. But whatever things happens outside, and if we were to view it as meritorious or as beneficial, then slowly they will become the causes of happiness. Therefore, in terms of their circumstances, let it be favorable or not, in fact, it is then how your mind grasps to it, how your mind would perceive it. This is in fact quite important. Because, for example, initially, we do not want suffering and we all want happiness, we all want favorable conditions. But if you were to perceive suffering as meaningful and valuable, though up on cursory inspection, it may be quite difficult to accept. But once you can do that, then it will be beneficial. This is really just how people would perceive it differently. Just as in a same busy city, there are people who really like busy city and who loves distractions, and then they would perceive this kind of busy city that is preoccupied with so many things as beneficial, not suffering at all. But there are people who really enjoy being quiet. They like solitude. In such a way, such kind of busy city is really a cause for their suffering. Similar principle would apply to a quiet cave, a retreat cave. Therefore, to the same kind of situation, but two people would have very different view on it if they were to have very different way of perceiving it or different graspings. Therefore, favorable or unfavorable circumstances, it really depends on how you would have your preference. Such as the Asians, when they look at Africans, it would occur to them that the look would be rather strange and vice versa. So there's really no particular existent particle on the circumstances, because if there were, then whomsoever to view it, they would come with the same conclusion, but that doesn't happen. So this is the profound teaching that's given in Buddhism. In this kind of profound teaching, in fact, there are people who don't really have deep connection with, and then of course they won't be able to understand it. But for those of you who can engage in contemplation of such teaching, then you will find out that this kind of teaching is in fact irrefutable, and it is truth. So we should contemplate upon it often. Traditionally, suffering is suffering and happiness is happiness. Of course, this kind of happiness and suffering happens or occurs because of the external circumstances. That's a traditional view. But if we were to look at it from a different perspective, of course, there's still happiness and suffering that is brought by the external circumstances. However, the core of suffering and happiness is in fact our mind. So I hope the classes these days, transforming suffering and happiness into enlightenment, could be beneficial to you in such a way. Of course, I could have taught it in a really brief sense, where it probably only takes 1 or 2 classes and I'll be able to finish the whole text. But I taught rather quite extensively because we live in this city with lots of confusion. And if you were to encounter this essential teachings in your lifetime, whatever suffering occurs in your life, you will be able to accept it with grace. So this kind of teachings, in fact, is the most useful out of all the knowledge you can acquire in this worldly life. Why is that? Because the Eastern knowledge or the West, in fact, there are very little that could ease our suffering. All the way from elementary school to university or to a doctorate study, or maybe you go abroad to study and so on. All the knowledge you acquire, in fact, lots of them are the basis or are the foundation for you to grow desire, hatred, and ignorance. In such a way, all the knowledge not only bring you happiness. In fact, it not only it will not bring you happiness, it will bring you suffering. So in such a way, are those knowledge valuable? So we can compare and look at the classes that we've been learning in on this text. And if we were to contemplate and practice upon it, then I think the profound teachings within this text would benefit you greatly in this lifetime. Why is that? It is because this is really the core or the essence of the relative teaching. But of course, you need a key to open up this core teaching, and that key is the key of lineage master. If you do not have this, but you only read and only listen to one class, I think it would be very difficult for you to actually taste the profound flavor of this Dharma teaching. The teachings from yesterday, if you were to only look at the words without deep contemplation and exploration and practice, then it would be difficult to understand. It would be difficult to grasp its meaning. However, if you do so, then you will be able to recognize that all the things, the happy and unhappy, the favorable or not, majority of them, in fact, are based on your own mind instead of the external circumstances. So over here, now let's continue with this kind of training. Then our mind and character will become more peaceful and more gentle. Buddhist or not, if your mind is not tamed at all, if it's not gentle at all, if it is full of volatility, afflictions, anxiety, sensitivity, or frailty, all of those negative emotions, then it would be not beneficial at all. So once we understand this teaching, I think we should then start taming our own mind, just like how butter melts in porridge. So it would be very gentle. This is how you should practice on your mind. Let it be during the day or at night. Your mind would be at a rather very peaceful and gentle state. Next one, it says that we will become more open and more flexible. If we don't have a good practice, if our mind is rather very narrow, then we are not really in peace with this nor with that. We cannot really accept anything that happens in our life. But if you were to practice well on the previous teachings, if you have an open and flexible mind, then wherever you are, you'll be rather very happy. I think the other day I said that the practitioners of the great capacity, they would view the cities, the bustling cities, and the quiet retreatant, all as his opportunity of practices, are all of his practice centers, practice places. But practitioners of medium capacity, they can only practice in solitude. And practitioners of the lowest capacity, they would view nowhere as their practice place. Everywhere could bring irritation. Just as stated in the Sakya's aphorism, it says that the fine steed is tame even in bustling cities, but the tigers are still quite tough and quite irritable even in quiet mountains. Just like practitioner, doesn't matter how long you stayed in certain quiet places. If you don't practice on your mind, if your mind is not tamed, you will still come out and maybe bit people. There's a Japanese Zen master. His name's Zushu Soseki. He said that if there are afflictions in your own eye, if you have afflictions in your own eyes and mind, then you would view the 3,000-fold world being very narrow and congested. But if your mind is clear and spacious, and there's no affliction within, then even a mattress, a place that is as big as a mattress is already spacious enough. So if you have nothing that's burdening your mind, then that is really the best time and best season in human world. Then it will be easier to get along with. So if you keep this kind of training, whomsoever you're with, you can get along with them. Be it the supervisors of yours, or good people, or bad people, or so on. You can get along with them very well. Just as the world's, just as nowadays there are people would say that, oh, this person's really smart, but he doesn't really have a high EQ. In fact, that is very true. There are people who have high IQ but not high EQ, not very easy to get along with. Then we will be courageous and confident. For a good practitioner, in fact, their mind is not so frail. They won't feel so scared whenever things happen. There are practitioners who, in fact, are quite courageous. If they were to practice upon this teaching, whatever things they face, they can face it with ease. I think there's definitely a big difference between the ones who practice and who don't. Once I was talking to some volunteers, some staff member, and some of them you can definitely see that they're very skittish, and they get scared very easily. They would look here and there. I don't know, they look really like some wild animals eating grass and being very much on guard. So living in this world, in fact, we're not really during war right now. There's really nothing to get scared of. Don't be so insecure at all times. Whatever things you encounter, your mind should be at ease and be brave. Whatever happens, you will be able to face it with a sense of confidence and stability. We will be freed from obstacles that hinder our Dharma practice. So the kind of practitioners, in fact, will encounter obstacles and problems, but because their mind is so courageous and so very much steady, then they will have confidence to face it. If your mind is rather weak, afraid of this and afraid of that, the other day, even during sleep, you'll be afraid of rats running around in your house. You'll be afraid of raining, afraid of thundering. You would be worried of different things, and whatever things happens in your life turns into obstacle. Today, maybe because of your illness, and tomorrow maybe because of conflicts, and day after maybe because you don't have good food, and then later maybe because of your mood, and then maybe your family issues, and so on. So people whomsoever don't have such a kind of training, then whatever they would encounter becomes obstacles. If you were able to transform suffering into enlightenment, then whatever happens, in fact, they are not worth mentioning. Even people who considers they're quite the unfortunate things that happens to you, you would view them as opportunity to transform that into practice. There are many different different kinds of people over here. I've been here for over 30 years, and during such, I've encountered many unimaginable things. And every time I've turned them into my own practice. I've turned them into favorable conditions for my own practice. So if we were to face all of them with wisdom, that would be really wonderful opportunity for you. Therefore, all of us, we may encounter things like this and that, but I think there are people who are so weak, then don't even mentioning about transform that into the path, or benefit other beings. I think it would be very difficult for them to get through obstacles. So we really have to be very steady and really have to be very firm in terms of practicing. Also, we'll be able to, and our mind will always be content in the happiness born of inner peace. If we were to practice in this way and transform suffering into enlightenment, then we will often have this mind of peacefulness, and whatever we encounter, our mind will be steady and will not be anxious, will not be afflicted. It won't happen like that. People with genuine practice realizations and insights, whatever things they encounter, they would think, oh, this is my opportunity for practice, and they will be very content, and they won't feel much fear. So this is really wonderful. Just as if a person even reaching the stage for cancer, I think the pessimistic ones would feel that, oh, this is it for me. I'm not going to live anymore. But for optimistic ones, they would think, wow, it's pretty good. I've lived for so long, so now I actually have opportunity to prepare for my death. So I think this is the kind of ease and contentment that we can develop by practicing this Dharma. And then to follow a spiritual path in this degenerate age, we cannot be without armor of this kind. In this degenerated age, the 5 degenerations, the degeneration of view, affliction, and lifespan, and so on. In fact, our world, we can see that very clearly in our current world, see it in the news and so on. We can see that there's war and there's pandemic, and there's a famine, and so on. If we don't have a firm or a steady kind of mindset, then it will be very difficult to go through it. It will be very difficult to transcend it. However, it is exactly because of this degenerated age, then we can use it as opportunities to transform suffering into practice, and then that would become the armor of our practice. Ponsoko Rinpoche and many genuine lineage masters, in fact, they've encountered more difficulties and obstacles than we can ever imagine, but they use the armor of this kind of perseverance as well as appreciation and intention of practicing Dharma, and they were never destroyed by it. Although we can't say that we're exactly like the copies of them, we have all their merits and so on, but at least I think what we can do is to also practice in such a way. Otherwise, it would be such a shame not able to follow the previous masters. Because if we are no longer tormented by the suffering of anxiety and irritation, not only will other kinds of suffering fade away, like soldiers who've lost their weapons, but even misfortune like illness will, as a rule, vanish on their own. If we don't have this kind of frailty or so on, in fact, I think the worst thing is actually frailty and suffering. For the men here or women, I actually think the women are stronger. Some men, they look really tall, but they're quite weak inside. They can eat a lot, they're tall, but their mind is rather quite fragile. Sometimes I would joke with them saying that, wow, you're like little girls. Maybe the way I presented it is quite is probably not very meritorious and maybe bring some faults to myself. However, I think their minds are quite fragile. Whatever little things they encounter, they would give up right away. In fact, they're great people in this world. Whatever things they encounter, they won't give up so easy. During our lifetime, even if you are an entrepreneur, you meet all different kinds of things and different kinds of people. But these kind of people, they don't give up very easily and don't generate irritation very quickly. I've encountered some couples, some of them who take turns to be on the post of managing Larungar, and after 2 years, majority of them don't really want to continue on their post or volunteer on their post anymore because they're so tired. They just want to find a quiet place to practice. There are some couples at the beginning, they're full of confidence. They said that I'm going to get a bigger opportunity around Lhasa, around there, and then eventually they get really tired. And I said, well, maybe you don't have to try so hard to find bigger opportunities. How about let's work on the opportunities inside Larungar? At the beginning, they felt this is just really not satisfactory to their ambition, but eventually, after 7 or 8 years, they felt, no, I don't want to work on that anymore. I'm just too tired. So I think there are people at the beginning of their volunteer posts. They're full of enthusiasm and full of great intentions and great ideas. But slowly, after encountering some obstacles and after encountering some things, they just retrogress or they want to give up. I think it also applies to our Dharma studies. At the beginning, I thought, what's the point of going out on a summer field trip? There's no time for it. We have to practice and contemplate upon time. Life is impermanent. This is how I understood. In fact, during Phuntsok Rinpoche's time, we don't really spend that much time on summer field trip. It's just very short few days. But now I feel, even though I felt at the time it was just too long and too much waste of a time, what's so fun about summer field trip? But afterwards, I think our minds would change after time. It means that, in fact, a frail mind, let it be, whenever you're encountering suffering, let it be slandering or humiliation and so on. Once you encounter that, you would be completely helpless. You would have no power of fighting back anymore. Just like how soldiers would drop all their weapons on the floor and there's nothing in their hands to fight the enemies. There are people who doesn't really want to go to hospital because once they get into hospital, they would ask, so what does this number mean? Am I going to die? Do I still have hope? And there are people who have a sense of ease and saying, that's okay. If my illness cannot be cured, then I'm ready at all times to die. I think this kind of mind at ease is in fact quite important. The saints of the past used to say, if you are not unhappy or discontented about anything, then your mind will not be disturbed. Since your mind is not disturbed, the subtle wind energy, the lung, will not be disturbed. The mind means that the other elements of the body will not be disturbed either. As a result, your mind will not be disturbed, and so it goes, the wheel of constant happiness turns. So, because your lung, your wind in your body is not disturbed, then the other four elements will not be disturbed either. In fact, when we are not in a good mood, we can then watch ourselves. When we are disturbed, then we would breathe heavily, and that shows that the wind is disturbed. And if the wind is disturbed, then the other four elements will also get disturbed, because the other four elements work with wind. Our body is really our body has these four elements, which then makes our health decline as well. Therefore, if we were to be in a state of bad mood or unhappiness, then if our mind is not disturbed, then we will then in a state of health and happiness. And this is quite essential. For the practitioners, I think we haven't really attained this kind of level of realization. But there are people, however, there are people who, after taking refuge, who got ordained and studied Dharma for many years, though you may have listened to many teachings and very carefully, but to completely eradicate all of the afflictions, you definitely need practice, because even after you understand the theory, if you don't put that into practice, you won't be able to eradicate afflictions. Afflictions can only be eradicated by actual practice. After practice, Dharma will then emerge into your mind. After attaining first bhumi, then you will be able to eradicate the afflictions. Of course, for the mundane beings, if after understanding the theory, you don't have to practice on it. After that, even if you practice upon it right away, I'm not sure if it's going to make a huge difference. I think maybe because maybe we got unhappy because of suffering, and then lead to the disturbance of wind and disturbance of the four elements, and then our mind would be in the state of anxiety. After we have this essential teaching, I think whenever our body is not healthy, when the four elements are disturbed, then we should understand the basic reasons. I think it really has something to do with our grasping and our afflictions. There are people nowadays who would say that we get aged rather quickly. In fact, it is because our mind is often in anxiety. I think there are people who have a rather very positive and very good kind of mindset, and in that way, their body doesn't age that fast either. In the biography of Mandela, when he was released from prison, he noticed that the fellow the fellow inmates who got imprisoned around the similar time, their hair all turned gray. But he himself didn't. His hair were still black after he got released. People nowadays would dye their hair. But of course, in the prison, Mandela didn't have opportunity to dye his hair. There are people, however, whose hair turned gray after even a few days. So if you were to have a good mind, good mentality, then even if you were imprisoned, your hair won't turn gray. You won't get aged so easily. So our body and mind, in fact, is quite closely correlated. There are people who don't want to get aged even a bit. They would put on different kinds of cream and different kinds of different things on their face because they don't want to get aged. So they spend a lot of time on their face. But if your mind is constantly anxious, it won't work. But if you were to have a really peaceful and calm mindset, just like the practitioners in mountains, they may not eat well, they may not dress up well, but maybe on one hand it is the nourishing from the mountains. On the other is because the mind is completely immersed with the Dharma. Then the happiness will continuously to nourish this person. So this is really wonderful, and the mind will not be in a constant anxiety. And then it says that also horses and donkeys with sores on their backs are an easy prey for scavenging birds. I don't think you're very familiar with this metaphor because you probably don't have lots of experience of riding a horse. Sometimes the horse would get sores or certain cuts on top of their back, maybe because of the saddle's not properly placed, or maybe they're wounded from the saddle because of the heavy burden or so. Then it would create some wounds. And then once the horse or yak has a wound on their back, then the crows or magpies would attack them. Especially they would stand on top of the back of yak or horse and start pecking on them. So yaks really are terrified of that. But if they don't have any wounds or sores on their back, they are in fact not fearful at all. They're quite very much at ease. So similarly, it applies to donkeys and horses. And then it says that people who are prone to fear, similarly, are easy victims to negative spirits, but not those whose character is stable and strong. In the old selection of Apandana Sutra, it says that once 5 people traveled together, and halfway through they encountered some hailing and blowing, and it was very difficult for them to continue with their journey. And then at that night they stayed at an old monastery that is rather very much sketchy. And in that momonastery, there's a vicious spirit living there. And I think there is also a statue made of wood, a statue of that vicious spirit. At first, four out of the 5, they were not afraid of that spirit or that wooden statue at all. But one of them is very much scared of the vicious spirit. And then the spirit was ready to harm that particular one who's afraid of him. But then that person saw the other 4 people were not afraid at all and felt that, why should I feel scared? They're not scared at all. And then he started getting quite confident in himself as well. And then at that time, the vicious spirit doesn't have any opportunity to attack them at all. I think at the end, they also burned down the statue, and the spirit didn't harm them either. I think it's really interesting because some atheists, compared to some atheists, there were some believers who thought that who believed that many of the holy mountains should not be exploited or destroyed. But the atheists, because they don't believe in karma, they would exploit and destroy as much as they want. I think sometimes they don't really get harmed by the spirits of the mountains and so on, maybe because they're not afraid at all. In the Gagnaganaja Paripracha Sutra, it says that if there's doubt in your mind, then your mind would be disturbed, and because it is disturbed, then the Mara or evil spirits would have opportunities to attack you. Similarly, in our idiom, or in our saying, folk saying, there's a common recognition that whatever you're afraid the most, you will eventually have to face it. I think this is really the manifestation of mind. If your mind disturbs because of doubts and fear, the Maras would very much appreciate it because it gives them opportunity. According to Bodhisattva Charyavatara, it says that if a snake lies dead on the ground, crows will act like brave eagles and attack it. In the same way, if my self-confidence is weak, even the slightest adversity will be able to harm me. In fact, the crows who tend to fear live snakes would attack the dead snakes. So for some practitioners, if you lack confidence, if you don't have inner strength, for this kind of people, even a little bit of adversity will completely destroy you. Just as the crows, in fact, they are not quite brave to begin with. They're not heroes at all, but they become heroes after encountering the dead snake. Just like a great eagle or great Garuda. In this way, if our mind is rather fragile, whatever affliction and suffering and obstacles occur, then we're also just like the dead snake. Whatever little obstacles appears in front of you, they will destroy you and completely take over you, just like great Garuda. Therefore, we have to be very brave inside of in our own practice. Ponsuk Rinpoche is very heroic. His heroism is not about holding up a gun and start attacking his enemies. It's not like that. He holds the gun of wisdom and completely defeat the enemies of obstacles on the path of practice. Therefore, we really should have the sense of confidence. Do not constantly think that, oh, poor me, I'm so unfortunate, this is just so very difficult, my whole life is not successful. If you were to give yourself such kind of negative feedbacks, in fact, they are not so great. This is the pith instruction. I think today I'll give some extra teachings. Please do not look at the time or signaling the time. There's nothing to watch for. You're not rushing to catch a plane or anything. So it is says that for the confident and brave ones, even the Maras cannot harm them. Thus, it is that the wise see that all happiness and suffering depend upon the mind, will seek their happiness and well-being within the mind. In fact, this is quite important. The wise and the fool have very different ways of looking at happiness and suffering. The wise ones, the ones who have genuine wisdom and who have genuine practice, what they'll discover is that whatever happiness or suffering, in fact, is all depending on our mind, our perception. If they were to search for happiness, they would search for it on their own mind. The basis of suffering and happiness is their own mind. If you were to search for happiness, you have to find it on your own mind. Since all the causes of happiness are entirely within themselves, they will not be dependent on anything external. Your own mind is just like a great treasure trove. Whatever happiness you want to gain from relationship, from wealth, or from other aspects such as social status or anything else, you will be able to have it. And you have it already. So this kind of happiness, at the very bottom of it, is really a sense of contentment. This is quite important. Because once you have contentment, you'll be very happy. If you're not content, whatever you have, then it is very difficult to have happiness at all, because happiness is really a content mind. In the Buddhist logic or Abhidharma teachings, it talks about how happiness is really a perception. There are many different kinds of perceptions. So happiness is a perception of mind conscious, and there is a happiness that comes from physical perception. In terms of psychology, when we talk about the 5 roots, in psychology, they would talk about the 5 roots that we have and talk about them in terms of senses, the sense of seeing, sense of touching and smelling, and so forth. But in the Buddhist logic aspect, we'll talk about eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, body consciousness. There's really those are the ones that does not distinguish. So we have to really understand that all of the distinguishing part comes from mind. And in terms of the sense of touching itself, or the touching consciousness itself is non-distinguished, or it doesn't really make any differentiations. But the happiness or not comes from that sense of touch, really comes from our dualistic mind. So happy or not, in fact, it all depends on your own dualistic mind. The dualistic mind is a sense of grasping based on your habit. Once we recognize that, we will be able to generate a sense of contentment, and then you will be able to gain happiness naturally. Without a sense of contentment, happiness is far away from you. In the Sutra on the Buddhist bequeathed teaching, it said that the contented ones, even lying on ground, they would feel at ease and are very happy. But for the ones who are not content, even if they are in heaven realm, they would not consider that is sufficient for them. So for the ones who are content, even if they're poor, they're in fact quite rich. Even if the ones who are rich but without a mind of contentment, they're still poor. I really like that part. In the sutras, it gives a lot of teachings, such kind of essential teachings. In Buddhism, we talk quite a bit about being content and eliminate our desire. It is not only limited in terms of our wealth or money. In fact, it applies to all of our desires. In terms of our relationship, if you were to think that, oh, I've got enough already, this is pretty good, with such kind of contentment, whomsoever you build a relationship with, you will have a sense of contentment. But if you don't get content, then whomsoever you're with, you will feel lots of suffering. Just like some celebrities, they would change different partners very often, very quickly, because you would feel that the other person cannot bring you whatever you want. Similarly, it applies to the world. It also applies to everyone's relationship, or it applies to the sense of searching or chasing after fame and social status. If you are a deputy chief, you probably want to become the director and then eventually a mayor and so on. But this is really because of your sense of lack of contentment.
前面我们刚开始的这个文章的开始呢，也讲了嘛，有情和这个无情的话呢，因为你很自主的，你很单纯的人呢，就是
and even
Also,
then it says that since all causes of happiness are entirely within themselves, they will not be dependent on anything external, which means that nothing whatsoever, but be it sentient beings or anything else, can do them any harm. And even when they die, this attitude will follow, so that they will always be free in control. There are people who would feel that even at time of death, they would be happy. There are people, in fact, that they feel that they're okay with anything, just like some of our volunteers. They would say, okay, I can do this post. Oh, you don't want me to do it anymore? That's okay, I don't have to do it. You want me to go there? Sure, I'll do that. You want me to volunteer in this post? Okay, I'll do that. There are people who are very flexible in such a way, and they would feel quite content in either in whatever situations. They feel at ease. If they get ill, they would think that, okay, I'll chant mantra, and then they would feel that they can die at any time. They would feel that in fact they are quite happy however, and whomsoever treat them in whatever way, their mind is quite flexible and very open. And in such a way, I think at any time they can attain happiness. This is how the bodhisattvas attain their meditative stabilization, or samadhi, called overwhelming over all phenomena with bliss. Bodhisattvas, beyond the first bhumi, they have a special samadhi or meditative stabilization called overwhelming over all phenomena with bliss. Wherever they are, or whenever the bodhisattvas are, even if they encounter people cutting their body, they would feel happiness or sense of bliss because of their samadhi and their realization. During the Cultural Revolution, lots of great masters are being burned, and I read in the biography of great masters, I think what they've been through is in fact hard to watch. Compared to then, I think nowadays people only suffer because of their mental suffering, rather the physical suffering. And this kind of mental suffering is mainly because of your karma, your habitual pattern, your grasping, and so on. And this kind of suffering compared to the physical suffering that is using fire and knife to directly cut into your flesh and muscle and even your organs. I think the physical suffering is so much more difficult to endure. But the great masters, because they don't want to give up the three jewels, they would think in such a way that whatever you do, I will not give up the three jewels. I've offered my body, offered many bodies in the past lives to follow the three jewels, and therefore I will just offer my body to the three jewels. With this kind of brave mentality, with this kind of brave faith, whatever suffering comes on their physical body, they will be able to endure it. And those are the great life examples that we need to learn from. I think people can contemplate upon it. In fact, nowadays you really don't have lots of suffering, and whatever suffering that you consider is really painful is really not that painful. Sometimes I would contemplate upon how I would turn out when I get aged, and I contemplated on what's the worst situation I can be during my late years. And I think that the worst situation is either become a beggar or being locked in a prison. So after contemplating upon these two poorest or worst situations, I think there's really nothing that would make me suffer. It's really not that bad. Just as Milarepa said, because of the elimination of deluded mind, the mind is full of happiness, and there's happiness here and then, and everything is happiness for me. I cannot say that I'm at this level of realization, but with the blessings from three jewels and the practice and teachings from the great masters, I think I'm quite happy in whatever situation. Just as stated in the 7 points of mind training, it says that if my death is beneficial to the sentient beings, please grant me death. If my illness is beneficial to sentient beings, then please get me ill. If whatever situation is beneficial to the sentient beings, then I can endure any kind of circumstances. Atisha, it seems that his mind changes quite a bit as well, just as how my mind would probably also change in between in my lifetime. But I think the genuine direction and principle is not going to change. So anyhow, to sum up, happiness is really reliant on yourself. If you depend on others to give you happiness, this is not very practical. This part talks about the wise ones. I think for the ones who want to practice transforming suffering and happiness into enlightenment, I really encourage you to read it every day. Temporarily, if you were to listen it today, it might be very difficult for you to transform it right away. You would still probably encounter suffering after class. But if you were to read little by little every single day and repeatedly reading it and continually reading it without letting this text departing your body, I think after 5 or 6 years you will recognize that your condition has already changed, just like how people after taking certain medicine they feel that they're much healthier than before. In fact, I read many different articles from psychologists from both West and East. Also, I read lots of theses from students from prestigious schools. However, I think that this kind of teaching is not taught in any of those. Not praising myself and slandering others. course, I genuinely think that the teachings are very meaningful. For great masters such as the Tenpenima, they left such great essential teachings to the later disciples as well as scholars. I think it could be very beneficial to many. Unfortunately, we don't really have that many audience today. I get less and less attendance every day. I can't really do much about it because this is not Maha'ati teaching after all. Maybe you don't want to listen to it. But if it was an Ati teaching, even if lots of you don't understand what I'm talking about, you would think, oh, look at me, I'm a great person listening to Maha'ati. I must be quite Maha or quite great myself. To transform suffering and happiness into enlightenment, I don't have lots of suffering. To transform it? What's the point of transforming it? I'd rather sleep at home, you may think in such a way. I'm sure there are people who are listening right now but doing many different kinds of things. Maybe they're eating or cooking. Well, it's a very difficult text to understand to start with, even if you're very focused, and don't even mention if you are very distracted. And now we're going to talk about the foolish ones. However, foolish people chase after external objects and circumstances in the hope of finding happiness. Many people, not 100%, but many people, I think we encounter them often, and when we encounter those people who would chase happiness on the external circumstances, we would think, why don't you just watch your own mind? Because you can't find happiness in your external phenomena at all. So this kind of people, in fact, are quite pitiful because they're chasing with such tiredness. But whatever happiness they do find, great or small, it always turns out like saying you're not in control, it's all in others' hands, as if your hair were caught up in a tree. Whatever you chase after, wealth or fame, or whatever things you chase after, you get it or not. It's just as if your hair is caught up in a tree because you give the control of happiness to others and not yourself. If you let other people to have control over you, then you have no freedom at all, therefore no opportunity of happiness at all, because you're under control of others. But once that person stops controlling you, you may regain your freedom and may have the opportunity to have happiness again. Similarly, if your hair is caught up in a tree, if you have long hair, especially in ancient times, then you can't move at all. But once it entangles, then you'll be able to regain your freedom. So similarly, the people in this world, they have the control of happiness in other people's hand or in other circumstances, just like how hair stuck in trees will not release you for any freedom. And then what you'd hoped for never comes to be. Things never come together, or else you make misjudgment and there's only one failure after another. First of all, if you were to count on others to bring you happiness, this happiness won't come. Just like happiness comes from relationships and so on. If you depend on others, then you won't be able to get happiness. Or even if you get it, then you won't get the whole part of it. You would the whole of it. You will get only part of it. And even if the other person brings you some happiness, he thinks that he has some kind of love or appreciation to you, but maybe that's not what you want. Maybe that's exactly the opposite of what you want. what you want. And that's from the angle of the worldly relationship. And from a different aspect, if we were to talk about wealth, you may think that money is very happy, then money could bring happiness, and then you try your best to earn money. But the kind of happiness that depends on money is not completely in your control or cannot be obtained, or you cannot get the kind of happiness you were hoping for. You can only get part of it, or that kind of happiness is not what you wanted or imagined. So your wish and the result that you gained may be very different. If worldly people could understand this teaching, in fact, I think it could be very meaningful. I think worldly people nowadays really think in such a way, just as how parents would wish their children would bring them happiness. But children could be very rebellious, and maybe they don't want to talk to you. Or people could cherish family members and want family members to bring them happiness, but then sometimes they won't bring you happiness either. Not only they won't bring you happiness, sometimes they bring you great suffering and pain. That's how worldly people live nowadays. If the kind of happiness, such as whatever you consider is happy, such as having house, cars, and having opportunities to travel, are there actually happiness in those things? Well, I think there are partial happiness that happens, or in the external circumstances, but you cannot depend all your happiness upon the external circumstances. You should know that the majority part of happiness, in fact, comes from your own mind. If you were to tame your own mind and adjust your own mind, then you can transform the external circumstances as happiness as well. And in such a way, then maybe you will be able to gain happiness in this life, in this world. Otherwise, you won't be able to. However, enemies and thieves have no trouble harming you, and even slightest false accusation will separate you from your happiness. Nowadays, in our world, such as marriage and so on, maybe they feel that everything's just really wonderful. It's a beautiful marriage, but in between the process of getting married, maybe the mother-in-law said so-and-so, or father-in-law said so-and-so, and then at that time, everything just falls apart. Because your happiness are completely depending on the external circumstances. Even a little bit of criticism, a little bit of changes could bring great suffering. That is because your happiness initially is very fragile. It is because you're foolishly thinking that the other person is the source of your happiness. Just as in the Jewel Heaped Sutra, where it says that if you use rock to hit a dog, the dog does not chase the person, rather to chase the rock. If you were to hit a lion with a rock, the lion will not chase after the rock, but directly attack the person who threw it. So our source of happiness and suffering directly comes from ourselves. And the wise ones know such kind of relationships, but the foolish ones thinks that happiness is dependent on the external situation. And in such a way, you really give others an opportunity to harm you and rid happiness from you.
这个是真的是不显示的啊，不显示的。
However much a crow looks after a baby cuckoo, it can never turn it into a baby crow. I think this is a really wonderful metaphor. We constantly think that external phenomena brings us happiness. In fact, this is very unrealistic. Just like how crows would try their best to feed the baby crows, but if there's a cuckoo bird that lives in the same nest, then even at the end of summer, even at the beginning of winter, the cuckoo bird would fly away. Cuckoo bird usually stays for the summer, but not winter. In the summer, they make really wonderful sounds. But once the cuckoo bird flies away, the mother crow would feel rather quite upset because he felt that was her child. And this metaphor talks about how we think that external phenomena brings us happiness, but in fact, they're only a little bit, not complete of it. This is quite a supreme essential teaching. And then in the same way, if all your efforts are misguided and misguided and based on something unreliable, they will bring nothing but fatigue for gods, negative emotions for spirits, and suffering for yourself. The gods would feel that, this person is just so foolish, I cannot help you. So the gods are fatigued from helping you or worrying about you. And then the spirits, in fact, they're not so compassionate, but even the spirits would have lots of negative afflictions or emotions or irritation, thinking about a foolish one for you. Even for the spirits, they normally don't have lots of empathy for human beings. They would think that, well, this person is just too foolish. In fact, the circumstances are just like the cuckoo bird. The cuckoo bird cannot bring happiness to the mother crow. This is the essential teaching. I'm not sure if you understand it. In this world, we have over 7 billion of people, but majority of them, in fact, count happiness on the external situation, external phenomena, and in such a way, majority of them ended up being very unhappy, and that is completely because of them. Majority of the reasons because of them. This hard advice brings 100 different essential instructions together into one crucial point. There are many other pith instructions on accepting suffering and hardship in order to practice the path. This is the essential or crucial point of over 100 different instructions. In fact, our mind is the most important. If you don't understand it yet, I think it will be difficult for you to bring happiness. Just as how Milarepa said, the ones who follow external affairs will nurture only afflictions and disturbance. And for such kind of Buddhist practitioners, they only live in suffering. The other day, a doctor said that he has lots of pain. I said, well, you spend your whole life curing other people's illness. You must have some pith instruction to cure yourself, isn't it? Just like how Buddhist practitioners would say that you need to study the preliminary practice, you need to benefit all sentient beings, but whenever they themselves have afflictions, they're just like the statues made of mud and trying to cross the river. Eventually, they will dissolve in the water rather than crossing the river. In such a way, they can't even help themselves. And that's the method. That's the aphorism. So this kind of teaching, this kind of crucial points, I'm not sure if you've developed some insights about it. I myself feel that indeed, the majority of sentient beings, especially the ones who live in great cities, they work for the money or the relationship. They work for lots of things. Of course, to strive hard, to work hard is fine, especially to live in this life. And I think this is nothing non-Buddhist about it. But if you were to count on the external phenomena to bring you happiness, then you're really holding the wrong side of the stick. Just as how the psychiatrist would, after research, they would claim that there's no happiness in the external affairs, external phenomena. In fact, that is wrong either, because there are some external happiness as well, such as a little pony and little yaks. In the summer, they're quite happy. They would run around. And if the animals have happiness in such a way, humans often do as well. But the core of it is really relating to your mind. If we were to practice transforming suffering into enlightenment, that is mainly taught in Chot practice. There are many different kind of profound teachings and profound pithy instructions, such as teachings in Mahaati and in Mahamudra, and so on, even in Prajnaparamita Sutra and so on. There are many teachings as such, but over here, I think that kind of pithy instructions is given in Bodhisattva Theravada as well, but over here the teachings are given more in a pithy instruction form. The teachings given by Atisha, Mipa Rinpoche, Longchenpa, and so on, the great masters given teachings that is easy to understand, and that is very practical as well. So over here, those are the teachings given in terms of transforming suffering into enlightenment in a relative sense. So now we're talking about the second part, how to use happiness as path to enlightenment through absolute truth. How to use suffering as path of enlightenment through absolute truth. I think for the wise ones, just as if they were to travel, they would take some medicine just in case, if they get high altitude disease or get a flu or so on, they would take different medicines accordingly. For the same reason, on the path, on the journey of this life, if you were to get sickness from affliction, it's really important to have the corresponding medicine as well. Now, the second aspect talks about transforming suffering into enlightenment through absolute truth. Now, by means of reasoning, such as refutation of production from the four extremes, in this state, let alone harmful circumstances or suffering, not even their names can be found. In the fundamental verses of Madhyamika, where it says that no entity whatsoever are found anywhere that have a reason from themselves, from another, from both themselves and another, or from no cause at all. So in such a way, in fact, there's no birth at all. All the phenomena, in fact, had never been a reason. After studying the four productions, after studying the refutation of productions from four extremes, we'll be able to understand that. For those of you, I think you won't be able to understand it. How many of you have studied Madhyamika Avatara or Madhyamika or the fundamental verses of Madhyamika? All right. In fact, I really encourage you to study Madhyamika. Especially, I think the Madhyamika Avatara talks more extensively about the four births. If you know that all phenomena had never arisen, the same applies to suffering. If there is no such a reason of self-grasping, then there's definitely no reason of suffering at all. In the mind mirror, the Chinese Buddhism text where it talks about also both in relative and in absolute truth, where it says that all of the virtuous and vicious will cause fruition, will have the result of karma. But that is in relative world. In the absolute aspect, there is nothing to obtain. So through many teachings and many refutations and so on, you'll be able to understand, in fact, no phenomena is ever arisen in the absolute truth. In the Chittamatra school, in the mind-only school, where it talks about the irreducible partless particle cannot arise, nor does the mind that cannot be subdivided. Longchenpa's text of wish-granting treasury in the 12th chapter, where it talks about methods, many methods about investigating on the duration of time. One of them, it talks about how in a room that is illuminated by the sunlight. In fact, the sunlight and shadow are also considered as a partless particle. So if there are 100 particles and I'm standing over here and shooting an arrow, if the arrow goes through the 100 particles that is within this room, then can you say that there is a duration of time that passed in this process? If you can say there is a duration, if there is no duration, then you're basically saying that even a kalpa had become an instant. If there is a duration, then it means that all the particles that it went through, in fact, is no longer partless, but divisible particles. Some of them are closer to you and some of them are further away from you. So this is how to investigate on that. Another way of looking at the indivisibility of your mind. For example, I'm standing here, I have two people over here, and there's a person A and the other one is a person B. So I have the two people standing in front of me. And in that one instant, if in my mind I have this thought that this is A and the other one is B, in fact, it is no longer one instant anymore, and it must be two instants. Why is that? Because at the moment where I recognize that this is A, that mind must correspondingly have another recognition of the other one is B. Then in such a way, it is no longer in one instant, because at the first instant I recognize A, there must be another instant I recognize the other person is B. So in such a way, it becomes two instant rather than you recognize both in one instant. If you were to say there's no duration of time in such one instant, then the one kalpa then becomes one instant. If you were to say there is duration of recognizing A and B, then in fact you are basically saying that the instant also has the one that is closer to you, or the other instant that is closer to be later time period. So in such a way, we'll recognize that, in fact, recognizing A and B in that one instant, instead of thinking that there is nothing to divide in that one instant, but if you were to delve into investigation, you can divide it into many. At the beginning, you would recognize that In one instant, I saw both A and B standing there, but in fact, it then split into two instants, and two instants can be split into 4 and into 1,000, into uncountable numerous instants. And then at the end, it seems that your mind cannot be obtained in that so-called instant. In the treasury of in the wish-granting treasury, in fact, there are many methods about that, about this kind of investigation. In the fundamental wisdom of middle way, or ornaments of middle way, as well as 60 verses on reasoning, 70 verses on emptiness, and so on. There's so many different kinds of supreme ways of investigating. At the end, you'll be able to understand that, in fact, all of the phenomena cannot be obtained in the absolute truth. Everything is dreamlike and illusion-like. After obtaining this kind of view, you can abide in it. So I think that lots of young people, I know you've read a lot and study a lot. For those of you who have a genuine ability to investigate, to analyze, I really suggest you to study more Madhyamika and Buddhist logic. In such a way, I think it would be easy for you to eliminate your dualistic thoughts. I think worldly people nowadays, they have all kinds of dualistic thinkings. You may feel that Buddhism is not right, it's not that supreme or profound, but after studying this Buddhist text, you'll be able to understand why I constantly say that though I study lots of Western philosophy, such as Adler, Freud, Jung, Aristotle, Plato, and so on, lots of great philosophers from the West, but their theory compared to Buddhism is still quite different. There's still quite a big difference between the two, and I think if you were to study Buddhism, then you will have more different gaining from it. Therefore, after understanding that suffering, in fact, in absolute truth cannot have even a name, don't even talk about the existence of suffering. There's no name of suffering in absolute truth. So for those of you who studied Madhyamika or Mahāti really well, you don't have to be scared of suffering at all. There's no name of suffering either. It's just like a child of a barren woman. What are you afraid of? So even when you in this state, even when you come out of this state, it's not like before when suffering arose in your mind and you would react with dread and a lack of confidence. Now you can overcome it by viewing it as unreal and nothing but label. I think over here the author did not talk about the investigation in the absolute truth, such as the methods that's used in Madhyamika or the way of abiding in Mahāti or pith instruction in Mahamudra and so on. He just basically talked about it very briefly. But this is quite profound, because after investigating in the absolute truth, you won't be able to get even the name of suffering. And when I read it, I think it's really profound, although it's really short. In the absolute truth, don't even talk about suffering. There's no name of suffering. I think this is such a wonderful teaching. I've learned lots of Madhyamika. In Madhyamika method, if you were to investigate suffering, there is no name of suffering. There's no name of suffering that can be obtained. Then there's no intrinsic existent nature of suffering. Then it's just nothing other than the child of a barren woman. Today we then talked quite a bit about this. If you can actually find there's an existent suffering that exists in you, for those of you, if you can actually find it, I will reward you with something really nice. Can you find it? If you cannot find the name of suffering, in the truth, in the absolute truth, without the name of suffering, what are we afraid of? What are we suffering from? Then in such a way to eliminate or to when suffering when the battle of suffering is no longer difficult, isn't it? In the absolute truth, there's no name of suffering. Is there suffering itself that existing? Indeed, there's nothing like such. When I read it, although I often study and read over in Madhyamika, it is similar to it, but over the 20-30 years, I study it every year, and every year I feel that I really understood, and this particular sentence and this particular teaching is very beneficial to me. So if you say that you can't if you can't find the existent suffering, I guess because you don't want to get my reward. If you were able to find it, I'll give to you my teacup, my mug, actually. Well, very good. So I think those of you are really good at Madhyamika study. So that's wonderful. No suffering is even better. Let's be happy, okay? It's a little bit late today. And tomorrow and the day after, we will have classes on both of the days.